I know that I needed it because at 40, when I started to learn, I had calluses, if you will, calcification on my neshama. It was very hard for me to feel anything with any purity because the life I had lived and the nature of my particular tests and character had created such a crust over me that very little got in. And I don't know how much I shared with you the last time we were together, but it was my husband, bless him, who brought me to this when he converted for the third time and dragged me along with him, kicking and screaming until I finally learned real Torah and was able to reclaim my birthright. And of all of the things that I have studied over the last 24 years, and I mean, as much as I could shove into my consciousness, the things I want to mention today have been the top contenders in leading a spiritually intelligent life. You know, in the regular world, EQ, the IQ rather, the intelligence quotient was so revered. I remember being 7 years old and having IQ tests in grade 1. This was something that was done back then. And then some 30 years later, we discovered the principle of EQ, which was emotional quotient. That was based on some test. I think it was at NYU with a bunch of kids and some marshmallows. And they were told if they could wait until the facilitator came back in the room, then they could have 3 marshmallows, or if they were going to eat them, they could have 1 now. And so they followed these particular children who were able to delay gratification. And around that, they developed this principle called EQ, emotional quotient. But there is something that trumps EQ and IQ. And this is what I call SQ, spiritual quotient. And it's so vital. This is not to say that each of the 613 mitzvahs are not meant to support and to build a fence and to build a scaffolding, a foundation around everything. But these principles to me took me from a place of such incredible coarseness, where my Hebrew name, and those of you who know me know my Hebrew name is Adel. And if you've ever met a person who is not an Adel Madel, that would be me. But these principles, sadly, these principles have brought me to a kind of at least internal Edelkeit. And I want to start with the most important one for me. And that is taking a look at the word rationalize in English and recognizing it for what it is, which is what we would say in English is a compound word made of 2 words, rational lies. 40 years ago, I lived with a man who was cross-addicted to drugs and alcohol. And the bracha that came out of that relationship was that he brought me into a 12-step program as he became sober. And the beginning of the 12-step program, which is now ubiquitous with many different kinds of addictions, and the world is filled with them. So if you or your children or your spouse or anyone you know is struggling with any obsessive compulsion or addiction, this is the state of the world right now. The baseline that they say in the beginning of 12-step meeting is this program, which is a God-based program, this program works except for those among us who are fundamentally incapable of self-honesty. What is self-honesty? It's the ability to sit with the discomfort of having screwed up and not telling yourself rational lies. There's an old story, famous story, perhaps you know it. King goes out it's always a damn king, but this king goes out for a walk in the forest around his palace, and every 10 feet he sees a perfect bullseye. Some archer has shot a bow and arrow, and there's a perfect bullseye in the most peculiar of angles, some on a 90-degree angle, some at the ground, some at the side of the tree, some very high up, but each and every one of them is perfect in the bullseye, and he's blown away. And he says to himself, I know that if I could have this archer and he could train my army, then I know I would never lose another battle. So he wanders through and he follows all these bullseyes until he gets to a small cabin in the middle of a clearing. And he sees the doorway, and beside the door is a quill inquiry, the bag and the arrows. And he knocks on the door, and a 7-year-old boy comes out. And he bows low and he says to him, "Your Highness, why are you here?" And the king says to him, "I am looking for the archer who shot all of those perfect bullseyes." And the boy says, your Highness, that's me. I did them all." And he said, you did them all? He said, "Yes, every one of them was mine." And he said, "Well, I need you to come back to the palace with me. I need you to teach my army how to shoot like that, and then we will be ever successful. Certainly you'll have a teacher, whoever taught you to do that." And he said, No, Your Highness, it's simple. I taught myself." The king says, "You taught yourself?" And he said, Yes, Your Highness, it's really very simple. You see, first, you shoot the arrow, and then you draw the target around it. That is rationalization. Something comes out of your mouth, you do something, you say something, you behave in a way that you know in your pintaligid is wrong, and yet you cannot do what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, which is the discomfort that comes from behaving in a way that is at odds with your self-concept. I think of myself as a good person, and yet I just slammed the phone on my mother. And then you begin to draw the target. Well, my mother has no boundaries, and my sisters are really angry at her too. And really somebody needed to speak to my mother, because if they didn't, she'd end up alone and lonely and have to take care of herself. And really what I did was an incredible bracha and a favor to her, because if somebody doesn't shut her down, then this is going to go on and bing, 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 there's your target. We know that the word chet comes from the Aramaic term, not for sin, but it's also an archery term. It comes from the principle of missing the mark. When you miss the mark, the person who collects the arrows picks them up, says chet, comes back to you, and what do? You pick up the bow and arrow and you shoot again. The danger of rationalization, the danger of not being able to sit with the discomfort, this we learn in the beginning of Bereishit, when we know that when Hashem says to Cain, "Why is your face downcast? Why do you look so depressed?" After obviously his brother's sacrifice is accepted and his was not. "Don't you know," says the Almighty, "that if you do better tomorrow, everything will be fine?" But then he says, "But if you do not, then sin is crouching at your door and its strength will be upon you." Chazal tell us what that means is simply this. When you cannot sit with the discomfort, when you can't say, "Yeah, I blew it. I shouldn't have brought you old wheat. I should have brought you the best of my flock like my brother did." When we make excuses, which was the very onset of Bereishit, when Hashem says to Adam and Chava, "Where are you, Ayeka?" And they say, "We're hiding." And God says, "Well, wait a minute. Why are you hiding?" "Well, because we're naked." "Well, how do you know you're naked? Did you eat from that tree I told you not to touch?" And what does Adam do? Adam says, "That woman you sent me, she made me do it." 3 times he is prompted to be fundamentally self-honest with himself and with his creator, but he cannot. And that was what expelled us from Eden. The inability to say, "I was wrong, I blew it, I'm sorry," and then pick up the arrow and shoot again. We become much more entrenched in our rationalizations. We know the Talmud tells us that the first time we do an avera, we feel badly. The second time, it's as though it's permitted to us. And by the third time, it's practically a mitzvah. The hallmark of spiritual intelligence is the ability to be intellectually honest with yourself and with others, to not rationalize, to know that we are all perfectly imperfect, that mankind was created in that way, that surely the Almighty knew what was going to happen in Gan Eden. And when he asked over and over and over, where are you? This is a question you need to ask yourself every minute of every day. Where am I holding with my capacity for self-honesty? That paradigm was modeled for us. The Almighty knew what would happen in Gan Eden. The meta message there, both from Adam and Chava, then from Cain and Abel, was to simply own the mistake and do better tomorrow. Because when we don't, sin is crouching at our door. And so, step one requires that fundamental self-honesty. It is not always simple, and it can make you vulnerable. But we also know from Gan Eden, what did Adam and Chava do when they realized they were naked? They hid. Why did they hide? Because the human condition is such that when we feel exposed, naked, vulnerable, our impulse is to hide. Not just from God, but also from ourselves. Step one, don't rationalize. If you're interested, by the way, I have a full 5-page handout on this where I contain these stories so that if you wish, I can send them to Barry and she can send them all to you later at a later time. This is a very good class to be able to give over to Jews of all levels. Number two is the recognition that this world is holographic. Michael Talbot, a scientist at Harvard University, discovered some 25 years ago when he wrote the book, The Holographic Universe, a very interesting idea. We used to believe, and I don't know about your high school experience, but I remember having to dissect a frog and a fish in science class. You took things apart, the biology of the animal or the fish apart, and you put it under a microscope. Your understanding was that if you understood the parts, that you understood the whole. But what Michael Talbot discovered in the early 80s is that nature and the world as a whole is more like a hologram. What is a hologram? Well, I suspect you know what they are based on your credit cards. There's a little one in the corner. But a hologram is created by taking an image, for example, an image of a glass, right? And then
Adrienne, could you wait a minute?
Sure. Do we have a problem?
Technical difficulty.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me know when you're ready. Can you hear yet?
It's connection.
Take your time. Hi, Ben.
It's a bit slow.
Uh-oh. Yeah. When we really spiritually understand that it's not just, yes, you know, all Israel is family, but when we really know that we are so holographic, that we come from these core souls and that we are all part of that, then we are able to embrace unity without uniformity, and not just in the community, not just, you know, the frum person able to have a conversation with the secular, the modern Orthodox with the Haredi, not that. I'm talking in our own families. When those we love make choices that disappoint us so profoundly, when we feel that they have somehow betrayed the family dynamic, we need to know that they are also still part of us, and that the Almighty's shoulders are broad enough to deal with all the loss and disappointment concurrent in a human being's life, but there is no such thing as other. There is no other. The second piece of spiritual intelligence is to truly internalize that there is no other when it comes to your fellow Jew. No other. The third piece, it's not all or nothing at all. Many people feel that they cannot do something unless they do it all. That by not doing it all, whether this might mean keeping up your practice in davening, whether this might mean keeping up your practice in learning, whether this might mean keeping up your practice in not speaking Lashon Hara. It's that principle that happens when you're on a diet and you eat a piece of cake and you say, oh, well, I truly screwed this up. I may as well finish it all and start tomorrow. The idea that it's not all or nothing at all comes from our fear that we will be called hypocrites. A hypocrite is not a person who believes in something deeply but can't get themselves there. A hypocrite is a person who pretends to believe in something in order to manipulate or deceive others. You are not a hypocrite if you believe deeply in davening and find yourself not. All that makes you is a human. One of the reasons that spiritually intelligent people do well in this world is because they don't call themselves hypocrites. We don't use our inability to do it all as an excuse to do nothing. This includes entertaining. Among this room, and myself included, I am sure there are women who are not able to do it unless you do it all, are not able to make it simple. Unless it's perfect, you can't go there. And again, as I mentioned, Einstein calls this an optical delusion of the consciousness. This idea that we can somehow do it all when we know, and the Talmud tells us that none of us will die with even 80% of our dreams fulfilled. The trick is when we say it's not all or nothing at all, I will read you from Maimonides so I don't butcher the quote directly. This is from The Guide to the Perplexed, a very heady and difficult book, and left me more perplexed than it did before, sadly, but this particular line stayed with me. Maimonides says, a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible, and therefore man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. Meaning, if you're trying to make changes in your life, Maimonides is telling us that it's slow and easy and faltering. You step forward a few steps, you move backwards a few steps. Perfectionism is the curse. And it's interesting because we learn that at the end of days, the Satan is not going to be punished for getting us to sin because that's its job. The Satan will be punished for helping us turn a sin into a mitzvah. One of the ways the Satan, the Yetzer Hara, works within us is in this entrenchment to all or nothing thinking. You know, I'm going to share honestly with you. I was 40 years old when I did Shuvah, and I had two little boys. And I read all of the books biographies, and I was sure that my sons were going to be Hillel. They were going to be lying on the roof of the base midrash in the snow, listening through the chimney so they wouldn't miss anything. So when they didn't want to get up and go to school or daven, I would yell at them. I was punitive. My older son actually said to me when he was 19 and still in Israel in Shana Bet of Yeshiva, I'm not wearing my tzitzis anymore. You know why? Because you used to yell at me when I didn't have them on. I did not know how to raise religious children. Like I said, I thought they'd all be Hillel. But I made so many mistakes of coercion, of punitive reactions, of punishment, when they were not following this path that their father and I figured out at 40. So who are you to know better? That I almost destroyed my relationship with my oldest child. It's taken me years to heal it. It's not all or nothing. Look for what's holy in them. And all of these damaging misconceptions, optical delusions can be reversed. If any of you at any point have damaged a relationship with one of your children and you would like to reach out privately for the formula that cost me thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in therapy and thousands of hours in conversation with Rabbanim, I would be happy to share some of what worked, because Baruch Hashem today, we're all good. We know that it says in Perkei Avot, I believe it's 2:21, that it's not incumbent upon us to complete the task, nor are we free to refrain from beginning it. Where there's much effort, there's much reward. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to finish everything. You just have to put one foot in front of the other. The next piece of spiritual intelligence, and these are all things that we have so many sources on. Those of us who live in lands where there are seasons understand that we are meant to learn from the seasons. Let me explain. I want to read to you now my favorite piece of poetry from Kohelet 3:1-8. I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. And those of you who are over 55, if there's anyone there in the room other than me, will remember that there was a band called The Byrds that turned this into a song in the 60s. It was called Turn, Turn, Turn. Somebody put up your hand if you ever heard that song. None of you? Oh, thank God. Okay. I'm going to, what, love? Beautiful. So now I want to read it for you directly out of Kohelet, because those lyrics, of course, were stolen from King Solomon. But I want you to listen like you're English majors, because these are a series of 13 what are called couplets. A couplet is a line that stands on its own that has a compare and contrast in it. A couplet would be, well, you'll hear in a minute. And I want you to notice something in the syntax, in the way it's written. He's teaching us a message. I'm going to read it now. To everything there's a season and a time, to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which you planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to cast it away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to stay silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Each of these couplets show something that intuitively is good or bad. The order begins a time to be born and a time to die. And that you would presume to be good and bad. Then a time to plant and then a time to pull out what you planted. Good, bad. Then you go to the next time, a time to kill and a time to heal. Well, that's bad, good. A time to break down or a time to build up, bad, good. So you have to ask yourself, is it two good bads and then two bad goods? But after this point, it mixes itself up. It's all over the map. The meta message here, my friends, is that nothing is good or bad. There is just a season for everything under the sun. Spiritually intelligent people understand what Shlomo Melech was saying. The reason we learn about this at Sukkot and we read Kohelet at Sukkot, where we learn vanity, vanity, everything is vanity, is because we have attributed good or bad to things that either feel good or feel bad. From what I've heard, drugs like heroin feel really good, but we know they're bad. And nothing feels as bad as 10 centimeters and dilated. Ow. And yet, it's the moment before the birth. It is good. There are things that happen that feel decidedly horrible and yet build us and make us grow, and things that feel so unspeakably good that eat away at our souls. When a spiritually intelligent person stops placing value judgments that something is good or bad, and instead replaces that mindset with there is a season and a time for everything, your coping skills explode. Winter is not the death knell of summer. Winter is the precursor for spring. Those of you who live in the north, I don't know if you know, but snow is the perfect insulation for the tender perennials that are planted in your garden. We know that on Tu B'Shvat, when we celebrate the sap that was rising in the trees all of a sudden, the outside of the tree looks like nothing is growing. The meta message for us is that just because something is dormant and you don't see the leaf and flower does not mean that there's a root system under the surface that is being fed. Everything is Gamzu L'Tova. If everything is Gamzu Ya'avor, if everything has its season, instead of seeing our personal nuclear winters of our life as being a punishment, we see them as the ground preparing for growth. because there's a season for that too. Just not necessarily in our time. The next thing that spiritually intelligent people understand. The paradigm is the scientific information that comes from outside that shows us how we look at the world that we're in. Then there is what's called the emotional paradigm shift. This was popularized by the writer Stephen Covey. In one of his books, The 5 Habits of Highly Successful People, he tells a story about being on a train late one night into Manhattan, and that the train, it's 11 o'clock and people are dozing or reading quietly. It's quiet, which is unusual in New York, reading their newspapers, when suddenly the train doors open at a stop and in comes a man with 3 little boys. And these boys are running like wilde chayas up and down the train, just losing their minds, knocking over people's coffees, just waking people up. The father happened to take the seat right beside Stephen Covey on the train. And there the father sat with his head in his hands like this, and he ignores his kids. Stephen Covey said he felt the emotions rising inside of him like a tsunami of rage. He said he felt his blood pressure increase. He felt, like when you used to listen to a seashell at the shore, that rushing in his ears as these kids are making more and more trouble, and the man is just sitting there. And finally, he's going to explode. And he turns to the man and he says, "Listen, excuse me, but do you think you could do something about your kids? It's 11:30 at night." And the man turns to him and he says, "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. We're coming from the hospital. My wife, their mother, she just died. They cannot cope, and I don't imagine I can either." And he said in that moment, all of the rage and the anger and the indignation that he was feeling melted away like snow under a fireplace. And he was filled instead with compassion and understanding and pity. And he knew in that moment that we bow down to our emotions. We think they're real, but our emotions are merely a result of our thoughts. Emotions are the result of our thoughts. And when new information comes in to change our thoughts, then our emotions concurrently change. This is what he called an emotional paradigm shift. Something from the outside, like the scientific one, comes in to change the way you look at a situation. Another beautiful, famous example of this, once again, after the Holocaust, when all of the skeletal young men were in the DP camps, Rabbi Silver from the US, from the Aguda organization and part of the army, went with Sfarim and with Sidurim to the DP camp. His intention was that he would do a minyan. Most of the survivors were teenage boys, the only ones who had enough muscle tone really and energy to make it through the end of the war. And he brought boxes of books. And he went to speak to them all one morning. And he said, "Tomorrow, we are going to hold a service and have a Torah reading. We are going to live for what they wanted us to die for." And all of them nodded, except one young man who stood back behind a fence with that typical 14, 15-year-old rolled eye, kind of arms crossed look. And Rabbi Silver went over to him and said, "Will you join us tomorrow?" And he said, "No, I won't." And he said, did something happen? Well, obviously something happened. You're angry at God. He said, no, I don't have an issue with God if he even exists, but his people I hate. And Rabbi Silver said, what are you talking about? He said, about a month and a half ago, there was a guy who came on one of the last transports who managed to smuggle in a siddur. And do you know that that man would give that book to be used, providing you gave your evening rations to him? He did it for 3 weeks and deprived all of his fellow bunkmates of either their morning or evening meal for the opportunity to read his siddur. So, we people of the book, I'm not interested in your book, and I'm not interested in what it means to be that kind of a Jew. And Rabbi Silver said to him in Yiddish, I still know, you stupid boy, why do you focus on one evil Jew and not the scores of Jews who were willing to give up their physical nutrition in order to feed their souls? And that boy said, you have convinced me. Of course, that boy was Simon Wiesenthal. We know that external information can change our emotional state, but the Jewish paradigm shift does not require external new information. The ability to shift a paradigm is to be like the Berditchever, is to be able to see a man in the mud wearing his tefillin, changing the wheels of his wagon, where his Talmud says to him beside him, look at that, look at him in the mud. And the Berditchever looks up and says, Almighty, how beautiful are your people. Even while changing their wagon wheels, they're wearing their tefillin. The job of paradigm shifting to a spiritually intelligent person does not depend upon external sources. You must do the work yourself. There's an old story about a little girl who walks into the kitchen when her mother is cooking, and she's holding 2 red shiny apples, and the mother looks at her and says, sweetheart, can mommy have one of your beautiful apples? And the little girl looks down and goes like this and takes a bite out of both of them. And the mother is mortified. She thinks, oh my gosh, I'm raising a sociopath. Who would do that? I have to call a psychiatrist. What kind of child would do that? And then the little girl hands her this one and says, mommy, here, this is the sweeter apple. And instantly the mother feels the guilt and shame. We don't see the entire picture. A spiritually intelligent person will reframe the paradigm to the positive. We know this. We know judging favorably. We know that the Torah doesn't say thou shalt not judge. You must judge. You judge 1,000 times before you leave your house every day. We must judge, but we must judge favorably. And we do that by inventing paradigm shifts that open up new neural pathways that allow us potentially to see a human being with a different lens. And God willing, they will live up to that way we see them. So just a quick review before we go on to another one. We're going to learn from the seasons. We're going to recognize that things are not good or bad. They might feel good or bad, but that there's a season for everything under the sun. We need to learn and to remember that we must not rationalize, tell ourselves rational lies. That sitting with cognitive dissonance and intellectual honesty makes us avoid the chet of Gan Eden. We will not be, all of us would have eaten from that tree, and all of us we'll spend our lives trying to get back to the garden. That is the paradigm, the model of human beings. And for those of you who might be over 60, there was a song by the artist Joni Mitchell called Woodstock. And she said, we are stardust, we are golden, and we're trying to make our way back to the garden. That is the state of the human being, trying to make our way back. To remember that this universe is holographic, and so are we. And that it is not a stretch to imagine that those, even the most different from you, who speak different, who act different, who eat different, who worship differently, each and every one of your fellow Jew is in you. They are Guf Yisrael, they are your finger, they're your toe. You don't get to determine that there is no place for them. We know that it's not all or nothing at all. We know that the Rambam tells us that it doesn't work when we try and go from 0 to 100 overnight. We know that Pirkei Avot tells us that we don't have to complete the task. And last, certainly but not least, we know that the righteous person falls 7 times and gets up, and that the righteousness comes in the falling, in the actual falling. And that is super, super important. The next thing a spiritually intelligent person understands is that their face is a reshus harabim, that your face is public property. What does it mean that your face is public property? You know, a few years ago, there was an expression, unpleasant expression, in the secular world where people complained that they had a resting B/ITCH face. Have you ever heard that? Put up your hand if you've heard that expression. Yeah, it's the idea that when you're just sitting there, you look unfriendly. Many of us look at people's faces, people who are not quick to smile, people who are introverted, people who are nervous, people who are not warm and fuzzy, because not all of us are extroverted. And we make judgments that we can't possibly understand, but the Torah tells us clearly, your face is public property. It is incumbent upon you, no matter what your mood is, no matter how bad your day was, that if you are in a public space, that you should smile. I don't know if you've ever read Yafi Eliach's Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. Spectacular book. Even though the stories are brutal, they're so inspirational. There's a story she recounts in there. I believe it's the Bluzhover Rebbe, Rabbi Israel Spira. I could be mistaken. But it's a story called Good Morning, Herr Mueller. And the story of a rabbi who used to pass on his morning walk one of his neighbors who had a field, a farmer's field. He would see him and he would say to him, "Good morning, Herr Mueller." And Herr Mueller would say, "Good morning, Herr Rabiner," and that would be it. And for years, that's what they did. Pleasant. He smiled at him. He was warm. Years later, in the camps, with his beard shorn and his body skeletal and barely recognizable, Rabbi Spirit stood in that line. And when he got to the front of selection, there he saw, with his snowy white gloves and his perfectly pressed uniform, his former neighbor, determining who was going to the left or the right. And as he stepped up, he lifted up his head and he said, "Good morning, Herr Mueller." And automatically, Herr Mueller responded, "Good morning, Herr Rabiner. What are you doing here?" And he lifted his hands like this. And he sent him to life, and the next day he sent him out of the camp. And he tells this story, not because that would have saved everybody, but he believed that his commitment to the mitzvah of meeting people with the acknowledgement that your face is public property, by greeting people with smiles and warmth, he believed that that mitzvah saved him. When you're on a group with lots of women, as you are, it is very easy for the people who are more introverted, less inclined to get up and dance, to feel somehow marginalized. We must greet everyone with a smile, but we also must look for those who seem like outliers and bring warmth to them. It is part of that responsibility. It's part of what we have to do. Last night, we talked about forgiveness, and clearly that is one of the spiritual intelligences. Remembering, please, if you weren't there, that forgiveness is not an example of further clarity. It's not the reinstatement of your ego because someone has made amends. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's a gift you give the unburdening of that crouching gargoyle that sneers out at the world. It's a leveling that's born of letting go, of loosening the grip on moral superiority, so that potentially we also will be forgiven. And last but not least, the most famous quote from Hillel we all know: if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, who am I? And if not now, when? We know this is from Pirkei Avot. But what I would like to read you right now, which I think is a very powerful notion, comes actually from a Christian writer named Thomas Cahill, who wrote The Gift of the Jews. And this is the last principle of spiritual intelligence, which is to ensure that you go to yourself, that you think for yourself, that you recognize that God made you perfectly imperfect and absolutely correct, and that you are holding a piece of the puzzle that cannot happen without you. And this is his response to Lech Lecha, leave, go for yourself, Abraham. Leave your land, leave your community of birth, leave your father's home. And here's what Thomas Cahill wrote in The Gift of the Jews. If we had lived in the second millennium BCE, the millennium of Abraham, and we could have canvassed all the nations of the earth, what would they have said of Abraham's journey? In most of Europe and Africa, where prehistoric animism was the norm, and artists were still carving and painting on stone the heavenly symbols of a great wheel of life and death, they would have laughed at Abraham's madness and pointed to the heavens, where the life of earth, they said, had been plotted for all eternity. A man cannot escape his fate. The Egyptians would have shaken their heads in disbelief. The early Greeks would have told Abraham the story of Prometheus. Do not overreach, they would advise. Come to resignation. In India, they would be told that time is black, irrational, and merciless. Don't set yourself in the task of accomplishing something in time. It is only the dominion of suffering. In China, which would influence the I Ching. They would say there's no purpose in journeying of any kind or any earthly striving on every continent, in every society. Abraham would have been told, do not journey, just sit by the river of life and meditate on its ceaseless and meaningless flow. This is why the final piece of spiritual intelligence must be the Lech Lecha principle. There is an essential self, a piece of you that is unique and must be awakened. Toscanini, a famous composer of the last century, was once listening on his radio with his biographer by his side to a symphonic piece that he had heard played a million times and that he himself had conducted many, many times, listening to see how the conductor interpreted it. At the end of the 3-hour, including intermission, he turned to his biographer and he said, wow, did you notice that was so wrong? Did you notice how off that was? Biographer thought, no, I did not notice that. And he said, yeah, this thing was written for 14 violins and there was only 13 in that. And the biographer thought, I'm not going to contradict this master conductor. I mean, if the master conductor is saying it, maybe it's true, but he kind of chuckled to himself and he thought, how could he know? But the next day, the biographer called Vienna to this actual concert hall where that was being played. And he checked in, and sure enough, that piece was written for 14 violins, and one person called in sick that night. And the master conductor could hear the one missing violin. And I am saying to all of us, the master conductor of the universe knows when you're not playing your instrument. And it doesn't matter if it's a violin or a bass or the drums or a tiny ding on the triangle once every year. The master conductor knows when you are not playing your instrument, when you are not honoring the Lech Lecha moments of your life. And so, as you sit here in this incredible land, getting chizuk from each other, know what your gifts are, but make that journey inward, because it may be a trip to the land, but what this opportunity for this chizuk mission is really a journey into yourself. And I will finish by telling you that today in the Omer count, we are at the Tiferet of Yesod. Yesod is foundation. It is characterized by the reproductive organ of a man. It is the bridge to bonding. It is the foundational understanding that commitment takes work, but the tiferet of this, the beauty of this commitment, this foundation, requires that we focus today on every beautiful piece of wisdom that is already ours, while we take this inner journey. My blessing for all of us is that we play our instruments and we live in spiritual intelligence, so that redemption to this fractured world.
She can't hear us, but.
I can't.
Could you
I
please
can't,
repeat
I can't
the
hear.
message? We didn't hear it. We had a glitch. Please repeat the final
I
message.
can't hear you. What didn't you hear?
We didn't hear the final message and the bracha. Thank you.
My final bracha to all of us is that we take that ultimate trip into ourselves, that we build the yesod, the foundation, by focusing on the beauty, the tiferet of the wisdom that we already own, that many of you have in your very DNA, that you remember, that you have lech lecha moments all day long, that you can decide whether to react with spiritual intelligence or whether to react impulsively. The beauty of the foundation is Torah. Torah is the Tiferet of Yesod. Sadly for me, I had to wait 40 years to discover it. You have a blessing that I could never imagine. My blessing is that you take that inner journey and maximize every single moment of your experience here so that your trip is one not just without, but also within. And that was my final